October 17, 1777. A British general steps into a rain-soaked field and quietly hands his sword to the enemy. Behind him, nearly 6,000 exhausted soldiers, once part of the most feared army on earth, prepare to lay down their weapons. Britain didn't just lose a battle that day. It lost an entire army, shattered its plan to crush the American Revolution, and unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would bring France into the war and change history forever. This is the astonishing story of Saratoga, the campaign that turned an empire's greatest confidence into its greatest humiliation. At the beginning of 1777, almost no one in Britain believed the American Revolution could survive much longer. From London's perspective, the rebellion was already collapsing. The British Army had driven George Washington out of New York the previous year. The Continental Army was freezing in the hills of New Jersey, plagued by expiring enlistments, constant desertions, and crippling shortages of food, clothing, and ammunition. Congress struggled to finance the war with paper money that few people trusted, while local governments often failed to provide the supplies Washington desperately needed. It looked less like the birth of a new nation and more like the final stage of a failed uprising. The British Empire, by contrast, seemed unstoppable. It possessed the strongest professional army in the world, the most powerful navy on the planet, and a global economy capable of funding military campaigns across continents. Members of Parliament viewed the rebellion as an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. They believed that once enough pressure was applied, colonial resistance would simply disappear. The only real question was how quickly victory could be achieved. During the winter of 1776 and 1777, British leaders settled on what appeared to be a brilliant strategy. Instead of chasing Washington endlessly across the colonies, they would cut the rebellion in half. A powerful army would march south from Canada along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River toward Albany. Another British force under General William Howe would advance north from New York City. A third column would move east through the Mohawk Valley. If these three armies linked together as planned, they would seize the entire Hudson corridor, separating New England from the middle and southern colonies. Without communication, reinforcements, or supplies, British leaders believed the revolution would slowly suffocate. To lead this ambitious campaign, Britain selected Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, a man who seemed perfectly suited for glorious victory. Burgoyne was a respected veteran, a member of Parliament, and an accomplished playwright who enjoyed the finer things in life. Charming, confident, and deeply ambitious, he believed this campaign would make him one of Britain's greatest military heroes. He personally presented his strategy to King George III and received enthusiastic approval. When he sailed to Canada in the spring of 1777, he carried himself like a commander who expected to return home crowned with triumph rather than burdened by defeat. But hidden beneath the elegance of Britain's grand strategy was a dangerous assumption. Every mile Burgoyne marched south would stretch his supply lines farther into hostile wilderness. Every delay would give the Americans precious time to recover. Every decision depended on perfect coordination between commanders separated by hundreds of miles. And if even one piece of that carefully designed plan failed, the entire campaign could begin to unravel. Far to the south, the Americans understood they could not defeat Britain through sheer strength alone. If they wanted to survive, they would have to turn the forests, rivers, and endless wilderness of upstate New York into weapons more powerful than cannons. Without realizing it, Burgoyne was already marching toward a battlefield where confidence, not courage, would become his greatest enemy. By June of 1777, Burgoyne had assembled one of the most impressive expeditionary forces Britain had ever sent into North America. Nearly 8,000 men stood ready to march. At its core were seasoned British regulars, veterans drilled to perfection in the disciplined tactics that had defeated Europe's greatest armies. Alongside them marched thousands of German soldiers from Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau, experienced professionals hired by the British Crown. Supporting them were Loyalist volunteers, Canadian militia, Native American allies, and an enormous artillery train carrying well over 100 heavy guns. It was a force built to overwhelm anything the Americans could place in its path. The campaign opened with exactly the kind of success Burgoyne had imagined. In early July, his army captured Fort Ticonderoga, one of the most important American fortresses on the northern frontier. After British artillery occupied the commanding heights overlooking the fort, the American defenders withdrew under cover of darkness rather than face destruction. Cannons, supplies, and equipment were abandoned as the garrison hurried south. The news raced across the Atlantic. In London, celebrations erupted. Reports claimed the rebellion was finally collapsing. King George III reportedly believed victory was now only a matter of time. Even within the colonies, many patriots feared that if such a powerful fortress could fall so quickly, nothing remained to stop Burgoyne's march toward Albany. For the British commander, every headline confirmed what he already believed, that the campaign was unfolding exactly according to plan. But appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Rather than taking the easier water route farther south, Burgoyne chose to push his army overland through miles of dense forest. It was a decision driven partly by confidence and partly by the desire to maintain the image of an unstoppable advance. On paper, the distance looked manageable. On the ground, it became a logistical nightmare. The American commander, General Philip Schuyler, understood he could not defeat the British in a conventional battle. Instead, he decided to attack something far more vulnerable, the army's ability to move. Trees crashed across every road. Bridges disappeared overnight. Streams were diverted to flood low ground. Swamps swallowed wagons. Massive boulders blocked narrow passes. Fields were stripped bare of crops. Livestock vanished, and anything that might feed the invading army was removed or destroyed. Every mile Burgoyne gained now came at an extraordinary cost. Soldiers who expected a quick advance instead spent weeks swinging axes through untouched wilderness. Heavy artillery had to be dragged across muddy ground that swallowed wagon wheels almost to their axles. Engineers built bridge after bridge while exhausted infantry struggled through unbearable summer heat. What should have taken only a few days stretched into more than 3 exhausting weeks, and every additional mile made the situation worse. The supply line back to Canada grew longer and more fragile. American militia appeared seemingly from nowhere, firing at isolated patrols before disappearing into forests they knew intimately. British foraging parties risked ambush every time they left camp. Horses weakened, food became scarce, progress slowed to a crawl. Then came an event that transformed the political atmosphere across the colonies. A young loyalist woman named Jane McCrea was killed by Native American warriors fighting alongside Burgoyne's army. News of her death spread with astonishing speed. Patriot newspapers seized upon the tragedy, portraying it as proof that the British had unleashed uncontrollable violence against innocent civilians. Whether every rumor was true mattered less than how people reacted. Thousands of hesitant colonists who had remained neutral suddenly chose sides. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers picked up muskets. Militia companies filled with new volunteers determined to stop Burgoyne before he reached the Hudson Valley. The British had hoped their native allies would intimidate the frontier into submission. Instead, they inspired an explosion of American resistance. By early August, Burgoyne faced another crisis. Supplies were running dangerously low. Horses were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the army desperately needed food, wagons, and draft animals. Hoping to solve the problem, he detached hundreds of troops under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum and sent them toward the region around Bennington. British intelligence assured him the countryside contained loyalist supporters ready to help. It was one of the costliest intelligence failures of the entire campaign. Instead of welcoming allies, Baum found thousands of determined American militia waiting under Brigadier General John Stark. On August 16th, fierce fighting erupted. The Americans attacked from multiple directions surrounding the isolated detachment. Reinforcements arrived too late to change the outcome. By sunset, nearly 1,000 British and German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Burgoyne had gained virtually nothing. No desperately needed supplies. No fresh horses. No loyal uprising. Only devastating losses that his army could no longer afford. For the first time since crossing into New York, the campaign's momentum had completely shifted. What had begun as Britain's unstoppable march toward victory was slowly becoming a desperate struggle, simply to survive. As Burgoyne struggled to recover from the disaster at Bennington, even darker news arrived from every direction. The western column under Colonel Barry St. Ledger, which was supposed to advance through the Mohawk Valley and join him near Albany, had failed completely. After meeting fierce resistance around Fort Stanwix and falling victim to American deception that exaggerated the size of the approaching Continental forces, Ledger's native allies abandoned the campaign without their support. His expedition collapsed, and he retreated back toward Canada. One entire arm of Britain's grand strategy had vanished. Then came an even greater shock. General William Howe, the commander whose army was supposed to march north from New York City and complete the encirclement, wasn't coming at all. Instead, Howe had sailed south to capture Philadelphia, believing that seizing the American capital would end the rebellion more effectively than supporting Burgoyne's campaign. It was a decision that would haunt Britain for generations. Whether caused by unclear orders, poor communication, or conflicting priorities, the result was devastatingly simple. Burgoyne was now advancing alone, deep inside hostile territory, with no reinforcements, no secure supply line, and no realistic hope that another British army would rescue him. Many commanders would have recognized the danger and withdrawn while retreat was still possible. Burgoyne refused. Driven by confidence or perhaps by pride, he crossed the Hudson River, committing himself even further to an offensive that was rapidly becoming impossible to sustain. Every bridge behind him represented another step away from safety. Every mile south narrowed his options. Waiting ahead was an American army that no longer resembled the desperate force Britain had expected to destroy. General Horatio Gates had assumed command of the Northern Army, and reinforcements poured into his camp almost daily. News of Bennington had transformed public confidence throughout New England. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and veterans arrived carrying their own muskets, convinced that victory was finally possible. Within weeks, the American army had swollen to somewhere between 12 and 15,000 men. Burgoyne could barely field half that number, yet he continued forward. The first major collision came on September 19, 1777, at a clearing known as Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne hoped to probe the American position and find a weak point before launching a decisive assault. Instead, he encountered one of the most aggressive commanders in the Continental Army, Benedict Arnold. Years before his name became synonymous with betrayal, Arnold was famous for something entirely different: fearlessness. While Gates preferred caution behind prepared defenses, Arnold believed the British had to be met aggressively before they could organize their attack. His arguments finally prevailed, and American riflemen under Daniel Morgan moved into the forests to confront the advancing British columns. The fighting that followed was unlike the neat formations of European battlefields. Dense woods shattered carefully dressed battle lines. Smoke drifted between towering trees. Officers struggled to see more than a few yards ahead. Small groups of soldiers fought brutal engagements at close range before disappearing back into the forest. Morgan's riflemen became especially deadly. Armed with long rifles capable of remarkable accuracy, they deliberately targeted British officers and artillery crews. Every experienced leader who fell created confusion among the advancing redcoats. British bayonet charges repeatedly drove the Americans backward, only for fresh Continental units to surge forward again minutes later. For nearly 4 relentless hours, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. When darkness finally ended the battle, the British technically occupied the field, but the victory came at an unbearable cost. Nearly 600 British soldiers had become casualties, including a shocking number of veteran officers whose experience could never be replaced. American losses were roughly half as severe. On paper, Burgoyne had won. In reality, his army had bled itself dry. Then began 18 miserable days of waiting. Every sunrise made Burgoyne's position weaker. No large reinforcements arrived. No fresh supplies appeared. The promised support from the south never came. Instead, American strength continued to grow. Militia streamed into Gates's camp almost daily, extending the defensive line and tightening the noose around the exhausted British army. At night, American patrols slipped through the darkness, stealing horses, burning supplies, and firing into British positions before vanishing into the forests. Food became desperately scarce. Horses stripped bark from trees because there was little else to eat. Loyalists quietly deserted. Native American allies disappeared into the wilderness, recognizing that the campaign was collapsing. Even the disciplined German regiments began to understand that they were trapped hundreds of miles from safety. Still, Burgoyne searched for one final opportunity. If he could somehow break through the American left flank, perhaps Albany could still be reached. Perhaps the campaign could still be saved. It was a desperate gamble, and within days, he would make it. On the morning of October 7th, 1777, John Burgoyne made the decision that would define his legacy forever. With supplies nearly exhausted and his army slowly being surrounded, he ordered roughly 1,500 men forward in a desperate reconnaissance toward the American left flank. Officially, the mission was to search for weakness. In reality, it was the final gamble of a commander running out of time, food, and hope. The Americans spotted the movement almost immediately. This time, they didn't wait behind their defenses. General Horatio Gates ordered a massive counterattack, while Daniel Morgan's riflemen struck one flank and New Hampshire troops crashed into the other. British formations that had once marched with perfect discipline suddenly found themselves under converging fire from multiple directions. Then, in the middle of the chaos, one man changed the course of the battle: Benedict Arnold. Officially, he wasn't even supposed to be there. After a bitter argument with Gates, Arnold had been relieved of active command. Furious at being sidelined, he ignored his orders, mounted his horse, and rode straight toward the sound of gunfire. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary displays of battlefield leadership in American history. Arnold galloped across the battlefield without concern for his own safety. He rode through exploding artillery fire, rallied broken units, pointed regiments toward vulnerable British positions, and personally led attacks wherever the fighting became fiercest. Soldiers who saw him charging forward followed almost instinctively. His courage spread through the American line like electricity. The decisive objective was a heavily fortified German position known as the Bremen Redoubt. As musket fire erupted from the earthworks, Arnold led the assault directly toward its defenses. Americans surged forward from every direction. After fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the fortification finally collapsed. Victory came at a terrible price. During the charge, Arnold's horse was shot beneath him. The falling animal crushed his left leg, shattering the same limb that had been wounded years earlier during the failed invasion of Quebec. He survived. History itself would never be the same. Had Arnold died that afternoon, Americans might remember him as one of the Revolution's greatest heroes. Instead, fate allowed him to live long enough for bitterness and disappointment to transform his name into a symbol of betrayal. But on that October day, he was still fighting for American independence. The fall of the Bremen Redoubt shattered the entire British defensive line. General Simon Fraser, one of Burgoyne's finest commanders, desperately rode along the collapsing front, trying to steady his exhausted soldiers. His courage inspired everyone around him, but it also made him an obvious target. An American rifleman fired from an astonishing distance. Fraser fell mortally wounded. His death broke what little cohesion remained within the British Army. As darkness settled over the battlefield and cold rain began to fall, Burgoyne finally accepted what he had refused to admit for weeks. The campaign had failed. His exhausted army retreated north through roads transformed into rivers of mud. Wagons became hopelessly stuck. Wounded soldiers had to be left behind. American militia cut off escape routes while Continental troops pressed closer every day. Within only a few days, Burgoyne's army was completely surrounded near Saratoga. There was no food. Almost no ammunition remained. American artillery dominated the surrounding heights. Sharpshooters made it dangerous for anyone to expose themselves above the trenches. Every officer understood the same brutal reality. There would be no rescue. There would be no breakout. There would only be surrender. On October 17, 1777, exactly as the campaign reached its heartbreaking conclusion, General John Burgoyne walked across a muddy field and formally surrendered his army to General Horatio Gates. Nearly 800 British and German soldiers laid down their weapons. It was the largest surrender of a British field army in generations. An empire that had expected a quick and decisive victory had instead lost an entire army. But the consequences reached far beyond one battlefield. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin had spent months trying to convince France that the American Revolution deserved open support. Until now, French leaders had hesitated, unwilling to gamble against the world's strongest empire. Saratoga changed everything. If the Americans could capture an entire British army, perhaps they could actually win. Only months later, France formally entered the war as America's ally. French money, French soldiers, and most importantly, the powerful French Navy transformed what had been a colonial rebellion into a global conflict stretching across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and the world's oceans. Britain suddenly faced enemies on multiple fronts. The strategic balance shifted forever. Just 4 years later, French and American forces would stand together at Yorktown, where another British army surrendered, and the dream of an independent United States became inevitable. The road to Yorktown began at Saratoga. As for Burgoyne, he returned to Britain, carrying not triumph but humiliation. Parliamentary inquiries examined every decision he had made. He blamed confusing orders, impossible logistics, poor coordination, and the unforgiving wilderness of New York. There was truth in every explanation, but none of them changed the outcome. He never again commanded a major army. His name became permanently linked to one of Britain's greatest military disasters. Benedict Arnold's story proved even more tragic. His shattered leg never fully healed. Watching others receive the glory for Saratoga filled him with resentment. Financial troubles and personal bitterness slowly consumed him until, only 3 years later, he attempted to betray the very nation he had helped save. History remembers him not for the courage he displayed at Saratoga, but for the betrayal that followed. Yet without his fearless charge on October 7th, the outcome of the campaign might have been very different. The Battle of Saratoga wasn't simply another victory during the American Revolution. It was the moment an empire discovered that confidence could become arrogance, that perfect plans could collapse under the weight of poor coordination, and that one defeated army could alter the destiny of nations. Britain entered the campaign believing it was about to end the revolution. Instead, it ensured the revolution would survive. And in the muddy fields of Saratoga, the balance of world history quietly changed forever.